Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Killdozer of extreme metal podcasts. R.I.P. to our big man Killdozer. It is his anniversary.
Killdozer Day.
Happy Killdozer Day.
And thanks to one of our Instagram followers for pointing that out.
And thanks to Killdozer for doing what he did.
Thank you, Killdozer.
We fully respect not only the things he had to say, but his actions. I am the death metal guy, aka Abath Ahegao Mouth Fleshlight.
Oh God, no!
That's terrible, isn't it?
Oh God!
The triangles in the corpse paint are like ribbed. You can feel them if you touch it while you're holding the head.
Right? No, it just becomes like Hello Kitty, which is just a horrible thought in itself. And mine can't even compare to that. I am the black metal guy, aka Grim Reaper Snorkeling.
Aw, the big guy needs a vacation sometimes.
He's on his way to a statistically improbable shark attack.
Yeah, who would be the worst black metal musician Fleshlight? I mean, Vrangson from Carpathian Forest would be way up there.
Yeah, Carpathian Forest. Or the guy from what's the Finnish band where he's falling down on stage?
God, something with an A.
I think it's Azazel. But
yeah,
it might be a different Azaz.
I think it's Azazel.
I think it's Azazel.
Yeah, that would be pretty rough.
Yeah.
Have you seen the video of when they were doing like a COVID show, like a practice thing, and it's just him like sitting on the couch doing his vocals or some shit?
I mean, we've all seen, I think, the clips of him talking in the Black Flame of Gehenna documentary, where he's sitting on the couch drinking what I must imagine is just straight vodka from a mug. That's a classic.
There's a lot of sort of classic inside baseball black metal footage. Like there's a classic video interview with Thornspawn that is just completely hilarious. I don't know if you've seen that one.
No, I haven't. But another good one would be the Prescriptor interviewed by Really Hot Chick.
Right? Oh, yeah.
Prescriptor sort of, he looks tangent to her off into the distance and starts spurging about Mesopotamian mythology for there's no, it's amazing. He's invulnerable.
That's classic. I think you've mentioned that before because I think that I related a story to that of Morbid Angel doing an interview with a topless girl one time.
No, I forgot that.
Oh god, yeah. So this was some mid or early to mid 2000 shit. This is early internet video content. There was some fucking thing where I guess some website where it was relatively attractive 7 out of 10 chicks interviewing metal guys and just taking their shirts off at the beginning of the interview.
That's pretty cool. I assume it all revolves around hey, my eyes are up here.
No, that's the weird thing is they're completely straightforward interviews, apart from the chick with her tits out, which is, I don't know, it's got a sort of a modernist anti-comedy quality to it. And actually a similar thing happens, David Vincent ends up spurging out about Lovecraft or something and completely ignoring the big-titted girl next to him.
Noble.
Great musicians think alike.
This is Josh from Defeated Sanity, and you're listening to Terminus Extreme Metal Podcast. Yeah!
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a really fun episode for you today with 2 records that basically speak for themselves, but we're going to review them anyway. First up, we have the long-awaited return of Adversarial with Solitude with the Eternal out now on Dark Descent Records. I'm really excited to get to talk about this record. One, because I really love Adversarial. Their 2015 record, Death, Endless Nothing, and the Black Knife of Nihilism is, I don't know where it would fall. Probably in top 50 favorite records of mine. It's really, really excellent. And it was a big influence on a lot of music that I was making around the time. So 9 years have passed and we'll give up the ghost right up front. It's fucking phenomenal. I think as it stands right now, it's my favorite record of the year. I knew that these, Yeah, I knew that these guys wouldn't disappoint, and they haven't. That basically suffices as a review. We will get more in-depth, but if you're listening to this show, this will be on your top 10 list of the year. I think that's just safe to say. Terminators are going to love this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just a litmus test for, do you listen to extreme metal for the, catchy tremolo melodies, or do you listen to extreme metal for violent, crushing riffs? And if you listen to extreme metal for the latter reason, this is, you're going to love this.
Yeah.
Right, this is the dividing line between people who like extreme metal and people who like black metal with fruity parts.
Mm-hmm. And it's a really great time for this record to come out, at least in terms of sequencing with the show, because we've been covering a lot of war metal or war metal adjacent stuff recently. And on the episode where we covered Diocletian, I had talked about some of the problems that I have with the genre. And this Adversarial record coming out is great because it feels like it was made as a direct response to those statements. Now, obviously, Adversarial have been doing what they're doing for a long time, but the timing is wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, would it be fair to say they've influenced your views on war metal? And
I think so, or at least they evidence a potential within war metal that has been underexplored. So for those that didn't catch that episode, I talked a little bit about how one of the problems with war metal as it stands is that it is essentially extreme black death metal that is listened to exclusively by black metal people. The crossover of war metal into death metal spheres is pretty limited, which is funny because it's supposed to have death metal as a fundamental component. Adversarial is a war metal band that is a death metal band first and foremost, hence the release on Dark Descent Records. And Adversarial is also a war metal band that actual death metal people listen to. This is a band that has a lot more just dyed-in-the-wool, death metal and especially old-school death metal fans listening to it, in comparison to nearly any other war metal band out there. So, being that they're very concentrated on death metal as a foundational element of the style, how does this make them different from their other war metal contemporaries? Well, it solves a lot of the inherent problems of war metal. One, it's far more technical. These guys are excellent musicians, and there's some pretty, dizzying, flashy stuff on this record that, despite the intensity of the technical performances, it's still very narrative and really contributes to the whole of the songs. The black metal that is present on this, and I've seen some people say that this is leaning into the more blackened part of their sound, which, is I can see how you would say that, but I think that's also just getting back to black metal hegemony, where it's a tremolo riff. This must be black metal, But really, the black metal that's present on this record that feels like the most clear influence is early angular stuff, Grand Declaration of War, the Thorns record, other stuff from right around the turn of the millennium, and all of that. Ackercock, yes, and all of that is to a greater or lesser extent the sound of black metal guys reaching into the sort of nascent tech death movement of the time to draw in ideas. Black metal unmoored and kind of directionless in the late 90s is trying to figure out what the fuck it's supposed to do. And that was an attempt that was made. It sort of turns into orthodox later on. And the other thing is that this is a super riff-heavy record. Now, there are riffy war metal records, but there's a sort of necessity for a lot of other war metal bands to have a sort of indecipherable grinding quality, at least in fits and starts. And even as blast-oriented and severe as this record is, it never really slips into that. This is a record full of riffs that want to be clear and articulate, and they're not at all hiding behind the haze of sort of clattering production. And, every riff is a fucking banger. Every riff reaches directly back to old school death metal, as well as just stuff that I personally love. There's a lot of cryptopsy on this record, suffocation, early brutal death stuff. And I just think it makes for a record that's really well-rounded and stands clearly apart from, the glut of similar stuff coming out now.
Yeah, I mean, there's an instructive contrast with the Diocletian record we covered a couple weeks ago, because, that was certainly an occasion for you to talk about this idea of what if you could do war metal that really is death metal that's being played in a more black metal way, right? Or that's, that's attached to more black metal ideological charge or whatever. You highlighted parts of the Diocletian record where you could really hear their Morbid Angel influence and hear their death metal chops. But all in all, that record, even for Diocletian, was a dramatic step towards their most primal, minimalist black metal influences. So that record had relatively very few riffs per minute. It was very focused on basically a handful of hyper minimal riffs. This is just, this is a short, tight record, 32 minutes. How many riffs do you think are on this?
Oh, God. 100. This is structured almost like brutal death in a way.
That's what I was going to say. It's about 3 riffs per minute. And you still get adequate repetitions and stuff, to achieve the sort of violent hypnotic effect, but the structures are very sophisticated in the way that Antediluvian is. Number one, I looked up similar artists on Metal Archives. Number one is Antediluvian. And
which is
the interesting thing is that
that's they're spiritually similar, but they sound completely different to me.
They sound completely different, and it's funny, they don't, even though they're Canadian, they don't share members. But I think you could hear some of the structural principles that Antediluvian carry really, really far being used in Adversarial you take those long and winding riffs that are sort of decoupled from typical riff shapes, and you put them in much tighter, more aggressive structures without all of the sort of, my dog is causing chaos. Unchain the wolves. You take those more sort of, gnarled Lovecraftian riff shapes and put them in much tighter, punchier structures, basically. But there's a similar overall, but like with Antediluvian too, there's adventurous song structure, and Adversarial delivers adventurous song structure just in 4 minutes, right, or less.
Yeah, I think the compact quality of this is very important. I think that there's plenty of war metal bands with short songs, but, they tend to be sort of 2-minute crypto punk bangers. Here, the relative brevity of the songs is used to increase riff density.
For sure.
You sort of fall into these labyrinthine nightmares of dissonant riffing in a way that's really, really cool. And I like how, the black metal flavor of this is almost used more to define and articulate the mood rather than be immediately present in a musical way. I mean, this is getting to something that I've always loved, which is the idea of, what if we did death metal, but very dark and very serious? We don't sacrifice any of the musical qualities of death metal, but we adopt the sort of ideological and emotional charge of black metal. And this is a great example of that being executed.
Yeah, it's analogous to the dark metal thing that, Heshenfirm is doing, but in this case with much more of a emphasis on the most visceral and high impact aspects of death metal.
I mean, should we just get to a sample, show them what it's like?
Fuck it. Let's do it.
All right, you got first.
Sure. So, You said in your notes, it's worth pointing out that this record simply starts with a blast beat.
Yes. That fucking rules. Just real quick, I just want to say, all right, after this, we're not allowed to do ominous chanting or drones or a dark synth intro. You start with a fucking blast beat. This is a metal record. Thank you.
Yeah. So it comes in hot, and basically stays hot, but especially you've got 3 very sort of tight, aggressive tracks at the beginning. This is the third of them. The second one, Hatred, Kiln, Vengeance, is awesome.
That's my favorite song title on the record.
It's a great title. It's a sick song. I just feel like this is one of those records where people probably actually listened to the singles ahead of time. Mm-hmm. We certainly did. This was highly anticipated on the Terminus Discord. So we all know Hatred, Kiln, Vengeance. But what about Witness to the Eternal Light? We're starting 33 seconds in after a bit of earned ambience.
That's hot as fuck.
Yeah, so you could hear a consistent strategy there in several of those riffs. Up front, you have a trade between a single string trem and some flyaway skittering arpeggios, right? And that's kind of that sound that connects to the earliest roots of orthodox black metal or to Grand Declaration of War or whatever. But it opens up with those, and then the riff turns around on just a buzzsawing late 80s, early 90s death metal riff, right? Just like power chords or low-end single string. They do that in a number of different ways. These riffs are densely... they're sort of complex nested structures. The main riff is a sort of A-B, and then the second A is like an A prime. It's varied. And then you get the B section again. They run through that, and they do the second full riff on the track never repeats. They just go back to the main riff. There's a lot of... These aren't through composed songs per se, but they could be. Right, they're using the methods of like traditional highbrow death metal through composition, and after about, what do you say, like around the 115 mark, they just let off this insane riff. You and I both exclaimed, right? And the timbral variation in that is crazy, right? They shift between this more chorded stuff, the arpeggios, and then into very crisp, clearly marked, cutting single-string stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think listeners there could hear the serpentine shapes that they share with Adversarial. The way that the melody sort of snakes around far longer than normal melodies are supposed to, and not in a way where you can tell it's just a standard riff form that's been elongated. Mm-hmm. It has its own specific, horrible shape. This gets back to a thing that we talked about at the very beginning of the show a lot, which I feel like core listeners are going to know, but newer people maybe not, which is, what is a melody, right? And so this is maybe a time to remind people, when casually speaking, people use the word melody to really talk about a harmonic property, which is consonance, right? The stuff, mm-hmm. the notes that sound clean and sort of pleasing to the ear, or
logically sort of connected.
Right. Yes, often we used to call those the epic parts. I might call them the noble parts, or, often the majestic parts. And of course, these days it's trendy to call them triumphant, right? But the mm-hmm. parts with those consonant melodies, right? Logically connected, yes. Logically connected harmonies. The classic example being, right, that big Amon Amarth riff that you love and pretend not to love is a highly complicated melody. But These are also, but you can play like a riff like that and have it not be particularly a melody, right? Because a melody is a drawn out phrase that kind of stands alone, rises above the harmonic background, and it's sort of longer. This is all relative distinctions, of course, but it's longer, it's more flowing, it has a sort of a developmental shape to it. It does different things in the course of going, as opposed to, say, like a discharge riff, which is a riff. Mm-hmm. Right? That's not really a melody. So here, I think you could hear both in these sort of dense cellular riffs, how they take these little riff structures and make much longer melodies out of them. And then in that crazy whiplashing serpent riff, these are melodies. They're just extraordinarily dissonant. Like mm-hmm. atonal dissonance in the way that is classic, used to be part of black metal, but is now much more of a death metal thing. And finally, you get that crazy moment that we both loved, where it gets a lot more grindy and every member of the band is screaming.
Yes. Yes.
And you get a bit of an epic or consonant harmony in the turnaround there, which is more just like pentatonic power chord, da, 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 right? Kind of an Impaled Nazarene bit. Mm-hmm. But that works as kind of an opening in the song. It does the thing that, you remember the Heresiarch record, which had all the most unimaginative and boring aspects of Orthodox black metal in it, right? Like, oh my God, it's a void, mm-hmm. right? The band just doesn't do anything, and somebody maybe plays a spooky arpeggio. This is a void in the song, but it's one of the densest, fastest, most aggressive parts of it, right? It all opens up into this weird, more stripped-down riff with all this layered yelling.
Yeah, and I think something else important happens there, which is, another idea that has sort of slipped out of modern extreme metal, which is the idea of, like, a big signposted moment in a song that you are supposed to remember that is not built around a consonant trem riff.
Yeah. It's not a hook. It's just an extremely exciting part. If you like brutal grinding riffs and, Dionysiac insanity, mm-hmm. there it is.
And it also, in a cool way, sort of reaches back to earlier strains of war metal, where you get that the chaos of the vocals and the aggressive like strobe effect channel switching and those like high screeching moans. So it ends up being really extreme and noisy, by playing with the production and the timbre in an interesting way, which is something that you would absolutely hear in like Bestial Warlust or Lust from Canada, some of the earliest war metal stuff before the style kind of got flattened into a particular manner of black death metal.
As much as we love to rip on Revenge here, the classic Revenge records absolutely have that kind of channel switching chaos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, the part where somebody says Yabsor and then the guy on the other side of your headphone says Yabsor, but they're slightly out of phase. That's sick.
Yeah.
Right?
Another thing that I really like about this and the album in general, a simple thing, but I like the fact that the primary vocal performance is like an almost brutal death gurgle.
I hadn't even noticed that, but that's a very good point.
Yeah. Now, so the sort of chaotic high stuff will come out in moments of big punctuation, but it's mostly a low kind of wet grunt in the brutal death style, which is, again, just another thing that aesthetically puts this just a little bit to the side of regular war metal. Now that everything's become a sort of like uniform bark or screech, and the really exciting guys from Kolkata will, they'll throw a pitch shifter on. That's not to shit on the Kolkata guys. That's some of the coolest stuff out there, but you get what I mean.
I think this record actually resembles the Apartaiva record in some ways.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, because the Apartaiva record is a war metal band that decided to just do a really straightforward death metal record, albeit like hyper technical.
Right. This is the Adversarial is the liquid idea, the liquid version of that idea. Apartaiva is the solid version of that idea.
Yeah. So let's get to another sample. So here is an example of Adversarial actually being at their most black metal, but in a really interesting way. So to me, the most substantial difference between this and previous Adversarial work is actually in terms of mood and atmosphere. So Adversarial has always struck me as a band within war metal or more broadly, rather, in extreme metal, that has a real aura of like darkness and destruction and negativity to it. Now, obviously, we are all jaded to the point where we can listen to Revenge and be like, fuck yeah, it's just party music, dude. But, like, Adversarial, to me, feels like legitimately kind of weird and creepy in a way that a lot of war metal doesn't. And I think this has to do with, I don't know, there's an aesthetic quality to it that is oriented around these ideas of sort of like malicious self-destruction in actually sort of like a more like 90s black metal way, sort of trenchcoat black metal, just updated and a little bit more serious. So
a theme that will return.
Yes, it will. So I want to go to the track Death is an Advisor in the Woods of the Devil. This album is nothing but 6 song titles.
Yes.
So what's different in terms of mood? This record is just covered in a sort of pervasive gloom and negativity and like anxiety and almost depression at times, which is a really weird way to describe a war metal record, but they really pull it off. Even in like the most intense fury and chaos on this record, there's this underlying sense of like personal malaise and hopelessness that I find really interesting. And I think that this track really conveys that the best on the album. man, I think that opening riff is sort of the last thing I expected to be on this record, and it works brilliantly. That's something that this band has never really done before, and this is kind of like the only place on the album where it occurs, and I think that's why it works so well.
I think there are a couple other places where you hear chords like that. I think you get it again in Fanes later, which I sample, but not to this extent, right? They're really those sort of like big, epic, but really melancholic chords are right out in front in this song.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like, not only is it the emotional center of the record, it like lets you know that this is a record with an emotional center. It's like, to me, remarkably affecting. And I think the way that the band rather, just leans on that melody for like a full minute before just chopping and dissolving it into like one of the most horrendous riffs on the record is really, really impressive and really structurally, again, affecting. You know, this is not a record you would expect to have that sort of emotional response to, but I definitely did upon hearing it. It's like, oh man, this sense of like, sort of like depression and then just like sinking into this sort of chaos of mental illness and self-loathing. Super, super effective, really impressive stuff. This is probably my favorite track on the record.
You haven't said it, but I've known you for a long time. I assume you're thinking that this feels a little like DSBM.
Yeah, you noticed that, and that was on my mind. Yeah. Definitely. I think these guys totally listen to DSBM. Like, that tracks.
Those first two riffs in particular, the one that, the very memorable one that comes in, and then the somewhat brighter, more uplifting riff that answers it, but is still very sad, right? That's a very DSBM chord pairing. It's, you could hear something like, I don't know, Abyssic Hate or something. Yeah. But, or Nyctalgia, right? But, yeah. And I was trying to figure out what else is in this more melodic stuff, because, I'm always going to go like, oh, it sounds like Nidin or Thy Primordial, but I don't think it does. I think, like, you can hear their connection, right? Adversarial are clearly connected to the intense technique and harmonic depth of a band like Axis of Advance.
I was thinking Axis here. And, like, Axis by way of, like, that band's understated funeral doom thing they've got going on. The Thergathon in Axis.
Right. When we reviewed Strike, we talked about the sad bagpipe riffs.
Yeah.
Which are, some of the more... They're delivered in a very aggressive and stirring way, but if you really listen to the melodies, there's something profoundly melancholy about them, or just sad, and sorrowful. And the other thing I was thinking is like ulcerate, right? Which is the obvious thing, but the way they're sort of letting those ringing strings overlap with each other to make chords, that feels like a very ulcerate thing, but again, executed, a gajillion degrees better than similar ideas on the Heresiarch record.
Yeah, I think that the smartest guys out in the metal scene have taken melodic and riffing ideas from Ulcerate, but sort of left their manner of structuring songs to that band. I think that Ulcerate is able to pull off these very open song structures that are prone to sort of void shapes. But they just have a mastery of that structure. I think the easiest thing to import into other bands is some of their guitar technique.
Right, just like, hey, that's a cool riff. Right, and you definitely get that here. So, yeah, awesome track. And I agree with you. The way that they suddenly are just like... what I was going to say was they kind of have this full, fleshed out idea of where the song could go just between those first two riffs, right? Those alternating riff shapes, you could be like, wow, that's a whole black metal song or something. So the fact that they have that and then a minute in, they're just like, this track is canceled. Right? It's, that's very cool.
Yeah, I really love this one. So, let me do another. So I'm going to do something that I don't know if we've ever done before on the show, or at least it's extremely rare. I want to play the end of the album. I want to go to the final track, Endless Maze of Blackest Dominion, and go about halfway in. Here is an example of where I think the cryptopsy really comes out for this band. You know, they're both Canadian, and I think the cryptopsy has just had a really substantial influence on Canadian extreme metal in general, maybe more than it has in the States or elsewhere. And this reminds me a lot of a track like Lich Mistress off of None So Vile, where it's based on this conceit of just like perpetually upping the ante of intensity, you know, until the whole thing kind of just explodes and convulses at the end in a grindcore manner. This is really exciting. This might be the best way I've heard a record end in like several years. So check it out. The ending will be faked out, and then watch what happens as it actually closes shop. So any other band would have ended the song 40 seconds before it actually ends, just on that kind of spiky Blood Oss Nord riff. And that would be okay. But Adversarial is a death metal band at heart. So what do? We start again. We light up into an even faster blast riff. And then in the last 15 seconds, we double time that and we get into like Last Days of Humanity grind blast territory. And it just explodes out with that double-handed, open roll. It's so fucking cool. You know, I love how decisive a statement it is. That it wants you to, it goes out on that because it wants you to remember that that is the core of the record. The core of the record is blast beats and, you know, brutal death riffs. You know, brutal death metal rather than brutal death proper. It's incredibly exciting. That whole song rules, and it just gets wilder as it continues. Again, you know, maybe the thing that just Adversarial wins on is just a sense of how to structure songs and pace them in a way that's just so much more exciting than nearly anyone.
Yeah, that was extremely exciting, and like you, I heard the obvious finish and then was thrilled when they didn't do that, right? Yeah. I mean, basically, there's like two climax riffs, right? You think you're, the fact that they finish that chiming Orthodox riff and then introduce the last riff and then interrupt it and then speed it up is crazy finesse. They do that, but they do that chiming riff, too, really well. It's done... They allow it to drone in a way a lot of the Orthodox bands don't. It sounds great. I don't know, yeah, it's really all about that double speed, like... is that like gravity blasting?
Not
a really fast blast.
Yeah, it's not quite a gravity blast. He's not really using the rim shots there, but it is just... It's brutal death style, like 284 blasting. And my recommendation is on the next record, the basic mode of the blast beat should be that. And we'll finally get the blackened brutal death record that's always been promised, but is never, like, fully materialized.
Now, do you want to end it there, or do you want to go to my sample?
I guess it's up to you.
Hey, what the hell? We gotten through this one pretty quick, so let's play another track.
Sure.
We're letting the fans hear how we structure the episodes. We usually end it when somebody says something cool and conclusive. But just like the structure of that last song, it keeps going.
We've got more.
Yeah, we're actually going to play the track before that now. This is my favorite track title of the record and track title of the year so far. This is Fanes at the Engur.
What is an Engur?
A fane. I have no idea what an Engur is. And a fane is a banner, as in, say, the Danish band Fanbearer, but it's also a temple. It's a word that's laden with a very potent philological charge, where there's some sort of Indo-European root there that implicates in a ton of different directions, right? It's a temple, it's a banner, what else is it? Well, whatever it is, it's at the Engur.
Well, so the Engur is apparently the Absu, the fresh water from underground aquifers in, like, Sumerian mythology.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, Absu Temple. That makes sense.
Nice.
All right. Well, here we go. Let's get fucking...
Feigned.
Children of Dagon time. So, what is really interesting there? Well, this is, here's another place where you can hear that almost through composed structure. They start out with more commitment to a drone section than you get on most other parts of this record. They've got one long riff, but it's very focused on drawn-out chords and leads. Sort of kind of a root note drone riff with some of those sort of shimmering runs thrown in. That's the main riff, and they do that for about 33 seconds. It cuts right there, but it reappears in later form in the song, and it's not the same riff. It's been like decomposed and restructured or dilated, stretched out in weird ways. They never actually repeat the riff, but they recap it in a cool way. So I'll just read through. I tried to map it as it played. I'll just read through this. So you do the riff one for about 30 seconds. Then we're in one of the only other really epic moments on the record. This feels less melancholic, just kind of majestic, stern, interesting riff shape, no repetitions, just done. Into another epic riff. This one feels almost like a classic heavy metal riff, or like a melodeath thing, except it loops back on itself in this weird way. Right? It's got this sort of like, you noted how weird that riff was.
Well,
right?
there's something something weird happens there. You were talking about time dilation. So these guys they do this a lot across the record where you'll have a looping trem riff where it sounds like it's one loop, but it's actually an A-B thing. But what they're doing is like inserting some of the passing tones into the main melody and like offsetting like the root note or the octave, you know, like an eighth note off of where they're supposed to be. It creates this really weird breathing effect.
Right. So it does this sort of like a big dramatic rise upwards, like a maiden riff or something, and then loops back on itself, throwing in those passing tones. Like it just ripples up and then down. Really cool. It's like you almost hear it played backwards or something.
Yeah.
And then we are into a kind of motif that they use again and again on this track, which I'm just going to call the Morbid Angel Stagger. You hear those kind of like stacked chord shapes, that step pyramid riffing, but instead of C being sort of architectural and towering or whatever, it feels more like it's kind of this staggering rhythm. It's sort of a rhythmic breakdown. And then you're back to that big low string trem, heavy metal style riff that like folds and unfolds and refolds. And then we're at another Morbid Angel Stagger riff, which I think is different. Then we're back at like a morph of the first riff, which is really cool. And then we do another stagger riff, and then we're at a second morph of the first riff, which like slows the tempo down by like halves the tempo, stretches it out, and it becomes much more sort of atmospheric. It's just really sophisticated songwriting. And it's but in another sense, this is one of the shorter tracks on the record. It's 3 minutes and 34 seconds, and it's just absolutely filled with killer riffs. Rolling in with another beer and full chub. We are back to review We Are God by Tsatthoggua, out now on Osmose Productions. Cheers to the completely unanticipated return of a Terminus favorite after many, many years.
Yeah. Who the fuck thought that was going to happen?
Absolutely nobody. I saw rumors on Instagram a while back. They started with, so I was like, hey, is it? But you know, with these things, it's always like they said they were practicing again, and I was like, well, let's see what happens, right? Mm-hmm. Because Dawn has been practicing again for 20 years. But yeah, it's been it's been 26 years. That's insane.
It's been 26 years, and the lineup is exactly the same.
And that is a sign of quality, right? We'll just throw that out right away, as we did with the Adversarial. This record fucking rules. We both love it. As with the Adversarial, the songs are pretty self-explanatory. If you like real extreme metal, no pussy shit, like this. So one thing we're going to do with the review, basically, is sometimes we try to get to the samples quickly. We got a lot to say about this band and this record, and it ties into a bunch of stuff we've sort of brought up before on the show and live stream. So we're gonna be talking for a while before we actually get into sampling the music. But quickly, I guess we should explain the sound here. Tsatthoggua is furious German blasting black metal from the trenchcoat period of the late 90s, famed for their extraordinarily radical S&M aesthetic, which they really carried further than pretty much any other band.
And took more seriously.
Yes, which is what we're going to try to articulate, right? One quick way of thinking of Tsatthoggua, the Cliff's Notes version, would be, imagine the Pokemon evolution of Rammstein. Right? Rammstein's whole concept is we are the most German band in the world. So we are both sort of intensely authoritarian and hierarchical, and we are also total perverts. Right? And but for Rammstein, it's all a shtick, right? Maybe not the sex stuff, but it's all a shtick. For Tsatthoggua, it is completely serious. And whereas Rammstein is basically a good, heavy pop band, Tsatthoggua is crushing extreme black metal. So there is a refusal to split black metal into any of its different themes or emotions here. They're all presented at once. Anyway, we'll get back to that. Death Metal Guy, you have some thoughts about the music here and the overall sort of how this record might be received, which I think are important to get out of the way.
Sure. So when I first heard this record, I I immediately liked it, but I saw it as maybe a little bit of a departure from the band's first two albums back in the 90s, which is like understandable that there would be a difference, but something didn't sit right with me. So I went back and I listened to the previous couple albums 2 or 3 times. And it's kind of interesting because when you listen to them closely, you realize that this new record is just a more polished and streamlined logical successor to their last couple records. I think that there is a tendency in, the extreme metal fan base to take certain records or certain bands and boil them down to their weirdest elements. So over time, Tsatthoggua, as, a sort of secret handshake band for dedicated black metal nerds, has had an idea forced upon them that they were musically, I don't know, maybe... I don't want to say...
Read what you got in the notes.
Oh, okay. Is that just the better way to say it?
Yeah.
Okay, so this lands exactly like an early 2000s trenchcoat black metal record should. It is blasting and ferocious and extreme, and it has all that like caustic fuck you attitude that we expect from it. So what's interesting is that relates directly to the first two. The thing about the first two is the weirdo characteristics of those records are kind of incidental. You've got some weird production, some sort of like slightly amateurish but still really good songwriting decisions, and this really wild aesthetic. But the problem is Tsatthoggua has been boiled down in the minds of a lot of people to those elements. So I think that a lot of people are going to be vaguely disappointed by listening to this record and hearing just a right down the middle extreme black metal record. But if you go back and listen to Hosanna Bazaar and Trans Cunt Whip, those are straight up down the line extreme black metal records.
Basically, people might be expecting it to sound more industrial or grindy or even symphonic.
Mm-hmm.
And to be fair, that's how I would have described it to people. Like, yeah, it's this sort of like grinding hyperblast black metal, but it really sounds like grindcore, and it has this German sadomasochistic industrial vibe, and it has this sort of rickety 90s synth black thing with keyboards cutting in at abrupt times and shit like that. But what you're saying is that all of that ends up being more incidental to the sound in retrospect.
Yeah, those were important, but relatively in terms of running time on those records, minor things. The moments where that sort of stuff is happening is really just like a handful of minutes across the first couple records. And it still continues here. But I just think, as a fan base, we have a tendency to only remember the most obviously novel parts of some of these cult records and end up forgetting about the core of songwriting. The reality is Tsatthoggua, first and foremost, wanted to be a violent and aggressive and in-your-face black metal band, and this record absolutely continues that. This sounds like a direct successor to Trans Cunt Whip, just many, many years later, and with a more polished production job.
Right, and so that's the thing that might confuse people, right? If you're expecting it to sound really idiosyncratic, you'll be like, oh, this is just a normal, kind of polished blasting black metal record. It kind of sounds like Marduk, right? If you're also younger and you're hearing this band for the first time, or you're as old as us, you're just not as depraved, you might also think, oh, this just kind of sounds like Marduk. Well, you're not. You're right, but you're wrong. So here's the interesting thing. Hosanna Bazaar, Tsatthogua's first record, which is pretty much their sound emerges fully formed on that, is 1996. That's 3 years before Panzer Division Marduk. Trans Cunt Whip, the second one, is 1 year before Panzer Division Marduk. Even if we want to say that Marduk really attained that sound on Nightwing a year before, in 98. Well, Nightwing comes out 1 month before Trans Cunt Whip in 98. So, Tsatthoggua really were there first. Does that mean Marduk were listening to Tsatthoggua? I don't know. I mean, probably. But I think what's more relevant is that they're listening to the same band, which is, and I got this from looking at the patches on the Metal Archives, Impaled Nazarene.
Yeah, right? Definitely.
And once you hear that, you're like, oh man, Marduk and Tsatthoggua really are both the later phase, and by later I mean really the iconic, now iconic blasting Marduk sound that emerged on Panzer Division. Sorry, weird burp. And Tsatthoggua, really, they're children of Impaled Nazarene. And what they have is Impaled Nazarene. They have their, you have your aggressively patriotic Finnish record, Suomi Finland. You have your sort of esoteric Indo-European Tantra record, Ugra Karma. And then you have Latex Cult, which is just all about bondage, right? And Tsatthoggua and Marduk both take that and run with it, and the only difference between the two is the ratio of sex to war.
Yeah.
Right? So, on that note, this is something that's come up a bit recently in one of our live streams and also in the Discord. And something we've been meaning to talk about for a long time, but Tsatthoggua is a good occasion to talk about a thing that is now misunderstood or simply not understood, which is the sexual element in black metal. Right? So you can... Where do you start this? Basically, I've got some shit in my notes. Let's just start really big picture. We've got basically, if with people who are new to 90s black metal, they're confused because there's this sort of there's a vortex that everything swirls into, and and what that vortex proceeds from is the annihilation of Abrahamic moral matrix, right? The end of Christian morality. And what's unleashed there is something you could call the anarch-authoritarian vortex. And the unleashing of all forces for harnessing and channeling and unleashing on the world. And part of that is obviously the sort of Nietzschean aristocrat, Viking warrior, vampiric overlord images that you get explored by the Norwegians. And part of that is also the pure sexual depravity that you get heralded in bands like Bathory, and then a lot, obviously, in the Finnish scene, in the Brazilian scene, and in the early 90s American scene, the early USBM. But also in the Norwegian bands to some extent. And when leftist kids from the punk scene hear black metal, they hear the sex stuff, and they assimilate it to their worldview, right? The only narrative frame they have, which is this narrative of oppression and redemption, right? Whereas, all the sexual identities and energies of the world are locked up under millennia of oppression, and they need to be sort of liberated to attain justice and freedom and all that. So in this case, sex becomes yet another theater for a kind of moral algebra and a narrative of world historical butthurt. Pun intended. But the other side to this, though, this cuts both ways. This misunderstanding, because, two, there's now a generation of kids, mostly, Zoomers and younger, who get into black metal from, 4chan lists or something, right? And they're like, oh, based and triumphant black metal. And they hear the sexual stuff in black metal, and they're profoundly confused. So let me give an example that I did on a live stream. an Instagram comment a while ago where some account I follow posted this awesome footage of a Ride for Revenge show, of course, and they're all clad head to toe in leather, trench coats, masks, and one dude the guy is like playing bass while pissing on a gimp.
Awesome.
Yes, awesome. And there's just a kid in the comments who goes, "Gay band?" ? And I followed this thread, and he was not trolling, right? He was genuinely perplexed. And I'm like, dude, like, gay doesn't even begin to cover it. And this is because people like that have grown up at a time when, I mean, and this has kind of always been the case for the last 60 years, but especially now, sort of the left, progressive culture, the punk scene, whatever, alt culture incorporated, owns radical transgressive sexuality, right? And almost owns sexuality in general.
Yeah, and as we were saying before we got on, it's territory that was just sort of ceded.
Yes. It's in part because, I mean, what's the alternative? Mohecan wholesome trad waifu? I mean,
God, that shit sucks.
right. That's, sure, that's all wholesome roll in the hay. That's all well and good, but that's really not going to that is not going to compete with the tremendous primordial sexual energies that have been unlocked by modernity, whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And we can relate to those energies. We can passively suffer them and lament as they dismantle civilization, or we can embrace the potential in them as civilization prepares for barbarism. And Tsatthoggua are ready for barbarism.
Yeah.
Right? And so, yeah, so for them, this is the black metal, the original black metal spirit of pure power worship. And, I mean, how to explain it in this band in particular?
I mean, I think that I've got a kind of equation that might roll into it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that something that's interesting is what's happening with Tsatthoggua, or like serious bands that do this sort of thing in general. Tsatthoggua is a band that's like really dedicated to Nietzsche and like, you know, the traditional conception of nihilism. And at first blush, you see the sort of like party atmosphere and the intense sexuality as maybe being this sort of, perversion of Nietzschean thought, and it just becomes about being a libertine and that there is no moral matrix, etc., which is like kind of true. But the reality is, the way Tsatthoggua portrays it, it's always part of this power process. You know,
Yes.
The emphasis in Tsatthogua's material is not merely on the perversion of sexual acts or the shock value, but the idea of, sexual power and like ferocity and intensity. Mm-hmm. This sort of, this reservoir of power that can be directed in so many different ways, but applied to sexuality specifically, bringing that sort of like animal vigor to it that might be absent in, a sort of cleaned up modern society. So, despite appearing to be this sort of, libertine thing, I think it's actually much closer to real Nietzschean thought than a lot of bands.
It absolutely, I know, I think it just is real Nietzschean thought, right? Mm-hmm. And this is and that's aside, again, Nietzsche these days gets short shrift next to his lesser children, like Evola, and, who you can like, who's great, but, Nietzsche is head and shoulders over him. Mm-hmm. And in part because it encompasses such a broader range of, there's a more encompassing view of the world. And one way of summing that up would be, so there's this in civilization, all these energies are locked up. And then in the crisis of nihilism, as Christian morality falters and people grope after alternatives, suddenly there's this open field, and it can either be engaged in this passive libertinistic way or in something more like this. So part of it, like, on the one hand, in the S&M stuff in Tsatthoggua, part of it is about dominance, right? And, very obviously, right, on the cover of the first record, he's just got a chick in a wedding dress on a chain.
And me and some guys on the Discord think that it may not be a chick.
Yes, indeed. So, this gets to the other side of it, right? This is carried, Tsatthoggua carried this far beyond the point that many people who are into this music think is cool, which is like, tough man dominate woman, right? There are liner note pictures from their early stuff that just are like, just guys chaining guys up, right? Mm-hmm. Like, is it gay? I mean, again, far beyond that. We'll discuss this at another point. But there's also stuff about being the submissive in these things. The second record, Trans Cunt Whip, really is about that. Boot over knee, cross-dressed whore, she forces me to take her law. I join in to live my fate, game of pain, love to be raped.
Jesus Christ. Oh, man.
But the track is, or the lyric is to live my fate, right? That's the Nietzschean concept of amor fati, right? There's a concept of sort of like, there's a practice here of suffering being willfully undertaken, right? And traditional and sort of established orders being deliberately transgressed, right? A norm that exists for a reason, but is sort of confirmed in the exception. And this is Nietzsche's idea of the Dionysiac, right? This unchaining from this norm that confirms the exception, this breakdown of structures, this unleashing of, as you said, sort of primordial animal forces. And in metal, we might say that the Dionysiac is about, violence, destruction. That's not actually the first thing he associates it with in The Birth of Tragedy. It's really about suffering, in some sense, because you're experiencing the world as a world of meshing and interacting powers far beyond you. And it involves the breakdown of the individual, right? The breakdown of consciousness, of boundaries between self and other, of social boundaries, of norms. And out of this, there's this insight into the world as will to power, but there's also this experience, this sort of catabasis, is a passage into and out of death, right? You attain a kind of death-like breakdown of the self, and you emerge out of it. And as you do this, you coordinate yourself with the vital forces of the world. You become Dionysus torn apart and then laced back together like the vines, or like Orpheus. This clearly informs Tsattoggua's approach to S&M, right? And to some listeners, they're just going to say, that sounds fucking crazy, or that sounds, fucking gay, or whatever. Okay, sure. But, you're missing the point. And the other thing that this, the thing that offsets this in part is that the band is, if the Nietzschean stuff was, as you kind of said, if the Nietzschean stuff were just window dressing for like, haha, we are sexually transgressive, that would mean nothing, right? But the record is informed by uncompromising elitism and a sort of very proud Germanness, right? This is, Tsatthoggua insists on being German. And we have I think the first track demonstrates that this is quite different from the usual that Tsatthogua's Dionysiac approach to sexuality is very different from the thing that's mostly offered in our current market of the senses, right? So there's a reason they lead off the record with a track called Master Morality, in which they're basically just reading lines from Nietzsche. Yeah. So, there was a guy in the comments the other week who was, acting like Nietzsche was some sort of existentialist individualist who just wanted us to, choose our own adventure or whatever. Tsatthoggua are having none of that. They rub your faces in the lines from the Genealogy of Morals that your college professors didn't want you to read. What is life? Oppression, profusion, exploitation. And this is being presented as a good thing.
A desirable state of affairs.
And certainly not a state of affairs to be lamented or suffered, but a state of affairs to be affirmed. And that is fundamental to black metal. And so they come... for all the gimp suit on the cover, they come roaring off the bat with a sort of brutal, masterful track like this. And it is and again they insist on having both of these aspects of black metal simultaneously, right? Mm-hmm. This is... and both of these aspects of German culture simultaneously. Both are maxed out and affirmed. It's one of the ultimate high-low bands. Yeah. We talked about that with Spite Extreme Wing, and here that's even more the case. The lows are lower, that's for sure. And it also,
it really, ideologically captures what you like to call fantasy Satanism. And mm-hmm. the vibe of the old Norse bands and what they were kind of exploring philosophically, better than almost anybody now. There's different strains of thought now, but very few bands are capturing that specific essence of the second wave like this does.
Yeah, I think that's true. The specific idea is, right, if you completely reject Christian morality, that means rejecting things that leftists don't like about Christian morality, like, the taboos on various kinds of sexual acts. Mm-hmm. And it also means rejecting all of the other stuff about brotherly love, free will, equality, mercy, pity, peace, blah, blah, blah. So it's a, and for the bands in the 90s, that was a whole hog thing, and those parts all seemed to go together, right? It is that the law is undone, everything is up for grabs. And that has been, really lost as black metal has turned towards a more solar affect, right? Which in many ways is a good thing. This uglier side of the music has been lost to the point where now you can get people making like was compatriot was supposed to be like like fucking right, like Christian conservative black metal. Give me a fucking break. So you have people completely missing the point. And Tsatthoggua are here to remind you of the point. Death metal guy, what do you have?
So,
wait, real quick, one more musical point to make. Mm-hmm. There was a cool riff towards the end of that sample that was kind of a single string, more melodic single string trem thing. Both of us were like, that sounds like Cradle of Filth.
Yeah, which is entirely plausible.
Yeah, so Tsatthoggua are people, as you said before, right? Before the show, you were like, Tsatthoggua think Windir is gay, and what I said is, and yes, and they think Cradle of Filth are chads.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I think, it would be, I really want to do a deep dive on Cradle of Filth's history and see if I can find more material about how they were perceived in the mid to late 90s. Before their enormous rise to success in the 2000s.
There's clearly a pretty similar vibe on the first, on like Her Ghost in the Fog or whatever.
Mm-hmm. I believe, I'm going to make a bet that I can't confirm yet. I bet that the understanding that we have of, Cradle of Filth being poo-pooed by the black metal scene is probably something that only happened in the 2000s. I bet they were taken seriously prior to fully gothing out, I think that's a very good hypothesis, because also a thing that unites Tsatthoggua with Cradle of Filth is the death metalisms. Yes, which is very important to this music. So a couple things I wanted to point out. Obviously, all of the riffs are sort of traditional and almost gestural, but executed with a tremendous aplomb. And this is a case where these are riff-based songs, but this is not necessarily a guitar-focused band. I think this is a real ensemble effort. I think that in this case, at least for Tsatthoggua, vocals and drums are as important to them as the riffing, which gives us a very authentically late 90s black metal feel, and also just helps it to feel really different from like the purely guitar-focused sounds that dominate 90% of black metal nowadays. The vocals are really burly and powerful and declarative and articulate to a degree so you can understand the lyrics. And I really want to take note of the drumming. The drum performance on this is fucking phenomenal, as it was on the first couple records. A strange note about Tsatthoggua that I think is interesting is that, as far as I can tell, the members of this band have barely been in other bands. So Tsatthoggua originally went by Dissection, starting in 89 and then changed to Tsatthoggua in 93. And all the members of these bands, even through the 20 plus year gap from the last record, haven't really done other projects, which I think is interesting, and I think is one of the big reasons this feels so unmoored from the standards of modern black metal. The drumming in particular, linking this back to the Cradle of Filth idea, is essentially death metal drumming. There's clearly an effort being made to almost sound like a drum machine, with these very abruptly cutting blasts that wait a moment before going into these traditional high-speed tom fills. The rigorous 4/4 timing and the deliberate lack of groove is something that sounds more like suffocation than just about any other black metal drumming.
There are basically breakdowns on this record.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, which is sort of like held over thrash stuff, because I think that's very important too, is that all the riffs on this record, and generally the way that it's structured, is sort of crypto thrash in a big way.
Yeah. Yeah,
like pedal point riffs that have been filled in with trem.
Yes, and really, we're talking before the show about this, but the YouTube comments, top comment is just top-notch DM blasted to my cranium, right? This guy thinks of it as a death metal record. Someone else refers to it as black thrash. And both of these are correct.
Yeah, they really are. This is really feeding back to a time where the it essentially had, but it hadn't calcified, the primordial ooze of extreme metal splitting into its fragmentary genre mess. This is both 100% a black metal record and also just as viably a death metal album when heard with a certain ear. So let me get to a really fun song. For this one, Tsatthoggua pivots to one of their other favorite topics, which is Lovecraft and related works. This is a track called The Doom Scrawl of Taran-Ish. This is maybe my favorite on the record. So we're going to open with a series of these sorts of like Marduk meets Darkthrone riffs, including like a really nasty kind of Panzer Division grind section. And then we're going to get to a very open and melodic chorus section. And then we're going to get into some of the other influences I detect in this band that people don't talk about quite so much. It's such a highlight. You knew I was going to pick that one up front, right?
Oh, for sure. I would have if you hadn't.
So I love the way this song is structured. So there's 4 riffs before we get to that big lead-driven chorus. The first one, listening closely, is almost like an early Cannibal Corpse riff, like something off Eaten Back to Life. Just this nasty little sliding chord configuration and then a little ugly trem lead at the end of the riff. Second, things open up a little bit, gets more traditionally black metal. And knowing how the song progresses later, you could almost see the chorus being dropped in here. But no, this is just a little peek into the future, which is oddly enough a very Cradle of Filth kind of technique that I might talk about more one day. Then the third and fourth riffs are ugly black thrash riffs. The fourth one in particular is almost like a Juder riff. And then bang.
That was the one that was like, drow, wow, drow.
Yeah.
You know, that also is like the, since you mentioned them on the last review, Cryptopsy. That's a Cryptopsy cocking the shotgun riff.
Oh, yeah, that is like a Cryptopsy breakdown. Yeah. So then, fifth riff of the song, like admirable restraint, and actually, like, the chorus is actually just like a minute in. So they just cycle through like a riff every 15 seconds up to that point, which is crazy density for a band like this. Then we get to the huge chorus hook. It's a simple, but just sort of like elemental, pagan black metal lead, or almost folk black metal lead, like a Windier thing nearly, with a super powerful double-tracked declarative vocal performance. And what I really love is, sort of an inversion of a technique we see a lot in big black metal choruses. Imagine a band like Winterfilleth. Winterfilleth and their giant, almost metalcore chorus would start with the blast beat and then move into the speedy double bass passage is like a breakdown configuration. Here, Tsatthoggua inverts that. We start with the double kicks and then ratchet up in intensity to the blast beat, which changes the contours of that riff in a really, really cool way.
That's a really good point. Because at first, right, you rely on the sort of stern nobility of that melody to carry the riff, right? There's a huge slowdown. You drop into that, and you have that sort of mountainous ascent, right? Blasts into the sprawling double bass. And then, rather than lower, if you keep dilating, the energy diffuses, right? So you just crank it back up with the blasts. And then the blasts are carrying the riff through the end. That's awesome. Yes.
So that lead in particular, we can associate it with a few potential things. I think one that springs to mind, somewhat ironically, given the band's original name, would be probably Re and Chaos by Dissection. That is a theoretical origin and stuff like that. The aforementioned Cradle of Filth would definitely do something like that. But I think more to the point and a bigger influence on the band overall is just later Immortal. Immortal is a band that I've talked about as always being sort of the secret death metal band of the, classic Norwegian bands. And just historically, they were always one of the Norwegian bands that more death metal people would listen to. They'd be sort of an exception to an anti-black metal rule. And the way Tsatthoggua embraces this legitimately like almost pop gesture there is very much in the same manner that Immortal would to great effect on records like Sons of Northern Darkness. And given the propensity for like high riff density and aggressive rhythmic performance and an idea of black metal still being forceful and muscular and strong before anything else, I just think that's really prominent here.
The other thing it reminds me of, which is post-dates Tsatthoggua, or their old records, would be, although I think probably Sons of Northern Darkness does as well.
It does.
Ragnarok's Blackdoor Miracle.
That's a great reference point. Ragnarok is a band that I love and always forget to listen to.
Same. Well, and I think for a lot of people, Tsatthoggua has been that too, right? It was the sort of ultimate, like, hey man, you heard this crazy sick band?
Yeah.
And Ragnarok, I mean, I bet they were directly inspired by this, because Ragnarok has the same sort of highly modern sleaze black metal, but delivered with all of the genre's lofty aristocratic spirit intact.
But
right?
also, like,
right,
don't forget, deliberately low IQ as fuck.
It is, yes. There's some really stupid... yes, Tsatthoggua is a lot smarter than Ragnarok. But there's also really sophisticated, intelligent riffing on Blackdoor Miracle, which is easy to forget. There's just some awesome Swedish Black Death type stuff. And there's also just big, dumb, heavy metal riffs like this.
Yeah.
And more important, there's bitches, there's guns. It's on the short list for best album cover of all time. I gotta get that. I gotta get a shirt of that.
Oh yes, I gotta get one. That would be great.
Nothing says it's party time like the Blackdoor Miracle shirt. But yeah, so there you can hear some of Tsatthoggua legacy, and maybe they're tapping in a bit to bands they influenced.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, we've also got to point out that they on this record they preserve the Teutonic mysticism. They've got a track called "I Drive My Dogs to Thule," which is a 7-minute Arctic epic. It's very cool. And beyond that, there's another mid-tempo song that I guess what I'm trying to say is the mid-tempo tracks on this are strong, right? Mm-hmm. I Drive My Dogs is a more mid-tempo one for the most part. And then No Paradise for Human Sheep. This is about as 90s black metal scrawling in his notebook as you can get for a title, right? But it's extraordinarily well written, and the riffing completely earns it. So this is it's going to start off. I love this track immediately. You get this sort of cortisol-raising panic riff, and then instantly we're into this sort of bolt-thrower horizontal groove.
Love the way they just do the chorus once and then just bang right into that fucking blast riff.
Yeah. There's some noticeable thrashism here too. That's sort of the mid-tempo groove there, where you got the double bass stuff. It's all right. That's the downbeat thrash drumming. There's crazy drum work too in that initial sort of panic-inducing lead part. There's really cool tom fills, and all of this escalates to we're not going to play it because I feel like for this record we want to focus on nuts and bolts attack riffing. Mm-hmm. But this track has a crazy climax where there's all these sort of overlapping lead parts, and the melody is almost like it's almost like a Diamond Head or garage punk kind of thing. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's a cool moment.
Yeah, kind of cool, swirling heavy metal leads. But I don't know. I just think it's important to flag some of the more heavy rhythmic work on here, tying back to some of the parts on Doomscroll.
Yeah. I think that Tsatthoggua has a picture of black metal that is very rooted in their time, their original time, rather. Seeing, I think the death metal element here is very important. I think that they see death metal as a set of riffing ideas and structural principles that they can access at any time and just do some light reworking into a more black metal context. So I have one more sample, and I think that it's worthy of noting that there was originally supposed to be a third record in the original run of the band, but then Necropolis Records fell apart. And that record was called Extasia. And I'm going to be playing the song off this record, Gloria Extasia. I bet a lot of this material is reworked material from around that era. I think there's little nods to older work here, and I think this might be, a record that was, unmoored from time, supposed to be released 20 years ago. There's been plenty of polish in the intervening period, of course, but yeah, I think it's fundamentally the same thing. So, getting back to what I originally said about Tsatthoggua being sort of misremembered as this particularly weird and eccentric band, well, maybe I'm walking that back because I think they are, but I think it's in pretty subtle ways in terms of songwriting and the way these songs are structured. I think there's a genuinely creative heart that lurks within this band, and that maybe what they should be remembered for is more simply just being an incredibly interesting traditional black metal band. So Gloria Extasia is a great example because you're going to hear a bunch of stuff happen and it's all really cool, but none of it's just really down the line black metal. A lot of ideas are being played with here, and they make them their own.
Keep us of the faith.
Yeah.
True believers remain.
Those
are almost terror riffs.
What's fascinating is I didn't recognize that at all until listening to it now. And you were just like, oh, we're playing Hatebreed now. I'm like, you're completely fucking right. Yeah. You know, it is like a recontextualized, big, burly hardcore riff from like right around the pocket of time these guys were originally operating. That is very 98 Hatebreed.
There's just way more rhythmic intricacy here in the way they deliver these things. Right?
Oh, of course.
But yeah, there totally is some classic Hatebreed or even like terror.
So we've got that. We've got the opening riff, which is this like skronky pentatonic thing.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's like a fucking prong riff or something.
It kind of bounces, right?
Yeah. It's like a sort of ridiculous parody of a Pantera riff or something.
Yeah,
it's so cool and weird.
Yeah.
Then the weird little watery, clean guitar thing that's just in there for a couple bars before we snap back to that demented fucking circus Pantera riff. And then all the hardcore stuff. And what's really fascinating is the fast looping version of that hardcore riff, how it starts with kind of a conventional breakdownish, like thrash breakdown configuration, and then the drummer lights into a fucking blast beat under it, and it's just one of the weirdest moments of the album.
Yeah. It's,
just the abrupt contrast there is crazy.
Lots of rhythms crossing each other in interesting ways. Yeah, really cool tom fills throughout that. Another thing I was thinking is they could have ended the record here. It's kind of like what you were saying about the end of the Adversarial record, right? They could have ended the record on that one riff.
Mm.
In this case, they do this track as a tour de force, right? And it has some of the more soaring and melodic moments on the record, and it also is just extremely dramatic in the ways that you've just sampled. They could have ended it here, but they keep rolling it for another 10 minutes, right? Which I think is, that is impressive and shows commitment. Wait, and we were going to cut it there, but then we kept talking, and the death metal guy got to some stuff that I think is important to discuss for this record, and a good way to wrap it up.
Yeah, so when I listened to this record, I one thing immediately struck me, which is that Tsatthoggua wants to play Vakken. And I've said that somewhat derisively before, but I don't know. I'm starting to reframe my feelings on that. As of late, over the past, year or two, I've grown a tremendous amount of sympathy for bigger metal bands or metal bands that want to be bigger. I think that the fixation and the impossible standards sort of ideologically of the underground metal scene are holding a little less appeal for me these days. And Tsatthoggua is a band that I am rooting for so hard. It's like, I hope they get to fucking Vakken. They would be a great band for that. The crowds would love this. And that's cool. I think it's paradoxically become an easy position to take to only respect black metal bands that, desire limited edition vinyl and cassette runs. Just in my personal experience, not that anything in particular is going on now, but just in general, being in a band is really difficult. And being in an extreme metal band is even harder. The amount of time it takes up, the difficulty arranging logistics for all the different people involved, and just, the constant reality that you are probably financially in the hole deep on this passion of yours. So, I think that maybe some more space should be made in our hearts for the desire of extreme metal bands to ascend while still making excellent music.
As you said in the notes, who's earned it more than Tsatthoggua, right? This is the epitome of a cult band, right? They did two classic records in the late 90s at a time when black metal was, if anything, sort of going out of fashion in some ways. Two classic records, silent for over 2 decades, and then they're just back in fine form, but with their, with the I's dotted and T's crossed in a different way, right? Why shouldn't they be huge?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point I would, just based on my experiences and obviously, hanging out with touring bands all the time and just, talking to people broadly, I don't think I'm ever gonna shame a band anymore for wanting to play to a fucking crowd for once.
Schizophrenic.